500 years of silence. One tooth. Everything changes. Picture a Spanish priest stepping off a ship somewhere on the coast of Luzon in the 1500s. He's seen a lot. Crossed an ocean, survived storms that killed half his crew. He thinks nothing can surprise him anymore. To be honest, then he sees a man smiling at him from the shore. Gold. The man's teeth are filled with gold. Not one tooth. Several. Deliberately shaped, carefully placed, unmistakably intentional. The priest writes it down that night. He calls it barbaric. He calls it vanity. He calls it proof that these people need saving from themselves. He got almost everything wrong. Incidentally, the people who filled their teeth with gold weren't performing wealth. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They were doing something far older, far more layered, and far more technically demanding than any European observer of that era could have understood. And the craftsmen who made it happen? Nobody ever wrote their names down. The priests wrote about savagery. Nobody thought to write about the skill. That's the gap this story lives in. Incidentally, the practice archaeologists now call dental gold ornamentation appears across pre-colonial Filipino sites spanning at least 1,000 years before Spain arrived. Skeletal remains found at burial sites in Cebu, Batangas, and several other regions show clear evidence of deliberate dental modification. Well, workers who specialize in ancient burial analysis have confirmed that these weren't accidents or post-mortem additions. People chose this while they were alive. Artisans fitted the gold while the person sat there, awake. Stop for a second and think about what that required. No anesthesia, no dental chair, no modern bonding agents. An artisan working with small tools, hammering or pressing thin sheets of gold into or around a living tooth while the patient held absolutely still. The gold pieces recovered from burial sites show remarkably consistent craftsmanship. Pegged shapes. Inlays. Sometimes the gold covered only part of a tooth surface. Other times it replaced a section. The precision on some specimens rivals what a trained goldsmith today would produce with modern instruments. There's a catch. The people doing this work had a name in Tagalog communities. Panday Salapi, or more broadly, Panday, which referred to metalworkers and smiths. Philippine communities before colonization produced sophisticated metalwork across many materials. Gold was abundant in certain river systems, particularly in Mindanao and parts of Luzon, and Filipino smiths had developed working techniques passed down through generations. Dental modification wasn't a side project. It emerged from a culture that already treated gold as something you shaped with intention and wore close to the body. Think about it. The oldest confirmed examples of this practice in the archipelago date to around the 9th and 10th centuries. Some researchers connect the broader regional tradition to influences moving through maritime Southeast Asia during the same when Philippine communities maintained active trade routes with coastal Indian, Chinese, and Malay traders. Gold ornamentation on teeth appears in other parts of the region too. Filipino practice wasn't borrowed wholesale from anyone. The specific techniques and aesthetic choices varied enough between island groups to suggest independent development running parallel to neighboring traditions. Here's where the story shifts direction in a way that most people miss entirely. Wait a second. The people who wore this gold weren't always the wealthiest individuals in their community. Burial analysis across multiple sites shows a mixed picture. Yes, many modified teeth appear alongside high-status grave goods, gold ornaments, Chinese trade ceramics, prestige weapons. But researchers have also found simpler burials where the only marker of distinction was the dental work itself. A metalworker's family couldn't always afford bolts of silk or imported porcelain. They could afford the material their own hands produced. One researcher working on Philippine pre-colonial material culture described it this way in a published paper. The dental gold might have functioned less like a status badge and more like a signature. You wore the proof of your craft inside your own mouth. You smiled, and people understood immediately what your hands could do. That reading changes the object completely. The gold tooth stops being jewelry. It becomes a portfolio. And then Spain arrived, and the portfolio became evidence of sin. The Spanish colonial project needed Filipinos to be primitive. A population that already worked sophisticated metallurgy, maintained complex maritime trade networks, wrote in their own script, and decorated their bodies with deliberate artistry didn't fit the narrative that ified conquest and conversion. So the documentation that survives from early colonial observers systematically flattened everything it saw. Gold teeth became barbaric vanity. Tattooing became devil worship. Oral literature became noise. The chroniclers weren't recording. They were building a case. Stop. The Panday and their descendants understood what was happening. Colonial religious policy targeted visible markers of indigenous identity. Tattooing declined under pressure. Certain weaving traditions contracted. The dental gold practice didn't vanish overnight, but it stopped appearing in the written record as something Filipinos chose. It started appearing as something Spain tried to stamp out. Wait a second. The craftsmen themselves become invisible at this point. Names stop appearing. Techniques stop getting described. The knowledge moved the way suppressed knowledge always moves. Quietly, inside families, away from written documentation. Pause here. A tradition that survived 1,000 years of open cultural exchange across Southeast Asian trade routes nearly disappeared in a few generations of colonial administration. The people who preserved fragments of it weren't priests or scholars. They were smiths who kept working, grandparents who kept teaching, communities that maintained their own understanding of what the gold meant, separate from whatever the colonial records said about it. Philippine goldworking traditions more broadly survived the colonial in certain regions, particularly in communities that maintained stronger autonomy through geography or sustained resistance. Mindanao metalwork, for instance, continued developing distinct aesthetic traditions that connect visibly to pre-colonial techniques. The through line exists. You can trace it if you look in the right places and talk to the right people. Modern Filipino researchers and archaeologists have worked for decades to reconstruct what Spanish observers deliberately obscured. The National Museum of the Philippines holds dental remains and associated artifacts from multiple pre-colonial sites. Researchers have published analysis of the metallurgical techniques involved using modern imaging to examine how artisans achieved the fits they did without modern bonding materials. The picture that emerges sustained technical refinement. This wasn't improvised. Communities had developed specific protocols, specific tools, specific sequences of work. The person lying, still with their mouth open, while an artisan pressed gold into place, trusted that artisan completely. The artisan had probably watched their own parent do this, and that parent had watched their parent. The chain of transmission ran backward through centuries. That chain is the part the priest on the beach couldn't see. He saw gold. He saw a smile. He wrote barbaric and moved on to the next page of his report. He never asked who made the gold. He never asked how long it took to learn. He never asked what the person wearing it felt when they looked in still water and saw themselves. But there's a detail. The Spanish colonial archive is enormous. It runs to millions of pages across institutions in Manila, Seville, and Mexico City. Filipino voices inside that archive are few. Filipino craftsmen's voices are almost non-existent. The ones who shaped those teeth, who measured by eye and by feel, who knew exactly how thin to hammer the gold before it would crack under pressure, they didn't get chapters. They didn't get names. They got called savage by men who couldn't do what they did. All right, the gold is still there, though. Sitting in museum collections, in soil, not yet excavated, in archive photographs taken by researchers who drove to sites that no Spanish priest ever bothered to visit. The teeth survived. The craft survives in what the teeth show. You can read 1,000 years of accumulated knowledge in the way a piece of gold fits against enamel. To be honest, all right, the artisan is gone. The work remains. And the work speaks for itself to anyone willing to listen without writing barbaric in the margin. Incidentally, The person who filled those teeth with gold wasn't trying to prove anything to Spain. Spain arrived 5 centuries too late to be the audience.